So we wanted to create something that was really useful to people that someone could pick up and start applying immediately to their nonprofit. The challenge with a lot of fundraising books is they're more theory, not a lot of action. So we wanted to see, could you create something that is really actionable, really short, and able to get someone to raise more money after reading it and then applying it to their nonprofit?
Welcome to Pages of Purpose. I'm your host, Isaac Smith. In today's episode, we are going to meet Trevor Bragdon, co-author of Seven-Figure Fundraising, a guide to help you raise millions to change the world. Trevor and his co-author Taryn Bragdon specialize in helping nonprofit leaders strengthen their fundraising skills to better serve their causes. In their line of work, they recognize that not everyone is a natural fundraiser, so they've developed a repeatable process that nonprofit leaders can use to raise money and also give them some of their time back that they need to work on their causes. With a background in behavioral science from the London School of Economics, Trevor has trained hundreds of nonprofit executives on how to refine their pitch and increase donations. In this episode, we discuss what inspired him to write this book, break down the core strategies inside of it, and also explore how you can deliver more value to your audience through effective fundraising and marketing. If you're new to the podcast, be sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. And with that, let's go to the conversation. Trevor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Isaac.
I appreciate you making time. And full disclosure to the audience, I was able to invite a guest of my own on the show of the many people that we have connected with us who like to come on and do interviews. This is one that I've been excited to make sure we save time for. With Trevor Bragdon. Trevor, go ahead and introduce us to who you are and tell us a bit about your book.
Sure. Thanks, Isaac. Well, I'm the founder of Seven-Figure Fundraising, which is a fundraising training company, and we train nonprofit CEOs on how to ask for large gifts, like 6-figure and 7-figure donations. And we put out a book last summer called Seven-Figure Fundraising, and it's been done really well. We've been in the top #1 spot on Amazon in the nonprofit space. Right now, I think it's in the top 10, top 12 right now, and it's just been this great journey. First, writing that first book and kind of overcoming those fears that you have with putting ideas down on paper, but then also just going through the process and getting feedback now that it's out in the world of people who have read the book, been able to apply it, and then increase their fundraising, which was the goal. So it's been really rewarding as well. Worth the effort to go through the torture of writing to get the outcome on the other end.
And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure we had you on the show. Is we've been blessed to have excellent authors who write about themselves, about history, who write about items that they're a specialist in, but it's not from like a business perspective or development when it comes to the structure of an industry or in this case, nonprofit. And so I wanted to ask you a lot of the same questions that I end up asking our other guests, but I want everyone to keep in mind who's listening that there is a different angle that we're approaching in today's episode. So just off the top, what caused you to want to write a book?
So we've been doing this training course for about 7 years, and a lot of times you get folks who reach out to you who either can't attend our workshop or they're just not in the place where it's good timing. So we wanted to create something that was really useful to people and that someone could pick up and start applying immediately to their nonprofit. The challenge with a lot of fundraising books is they're more theory, not a lot of action. So we wanted to see, could you create something that is really actionable, really short? Because a lot of business books are way too long. It could have been an article or could have been an email instead of a 250-page book. And we wanted to see, can we get something that's tight, really useful, and able to get someone to raise more money after reading it and then applying it to their nonprofit?
So you were able to distill a lot of your content into a high value, high impact package.
Yeah, so I got the idea on the framework for the book from a book by Rob Fitzpatrick called Write Useful Books. And it's a short book, and his whole premise is the idea that most nonfiction books are too long. They were made to be a certain thickness because they had to take a certain amount of shelf space to have a title. So that's why most nonfiction books are 200, 250 words or longer, 250 pages rather, or longer. And for most things, you just want a manual that you can pick up and solve a problem. So his approach and how he recommends is to do two things. One, have a book that's to a targeted niche of people that's really useful. And then the second part of it is to test it out on beta readers first. So you're not just launching a book into the public, hoping people buy. You'll get getting feedback ahead of time before you release it on what parts are confusing, what's missing, what could be better.
And that's a lot of the same process other guests have talked about going through, whether it's with a group of people that they hold very closely or whether it's with working with a professional team that can take them through the writing process. And I'm curious, when it comes to creating the content, what is it that you have to do differently when you're writing a book about this topic that you're an expert in versus when you're sitting there teaching it? Does something major have to shift when it's, here's a book versus, hey, I'm going to go through this process with you?
So it's interesting. I thought it would be easy to write a book at first because we taught it so much. Like we were on, I think, workshop number 75 that we're done. So you've taught through the material, like it's almost, you know it like almost to like happy birthday song level of how familiar you are with it. But distilling it down into actual writing is this thing that makes you pretty nervous. And I had set a goal in 2023 to write a book. And then nothing happens until like midsummer 2023. And I'm realizing like, okay, we haven't made any progress on this book. Why? And I was like really candid with myself and like thinking about this and realized like there's a lot of fear about I'll write something and then we'll put it out and no one will buy it. And then it'll be this big wasted effort where I've put in a ton of time, the best ideas I have, and you're kind of rejected by the market. So I had a lot of fear around that, even though I knew, people buy our product, people have good results with our training, but could it transfer into a book process? So I actually, in summer 2023, I was like really struggling, like a lot of imposter syndrome and just worried about putting these ideas on paper. And I had a friend who's a counselor, and I actually reached out to him. I said, like, I just want to buy an hour of your time and talk you through this because it's logically, it doesn't make any sense I know this topic really well. I teach this thing, but why can't I get myself to start writing that first draft? And so through a conversation with him, we realized like it's just needing to start and figuring out what's the system to make it as easy as possible to start. And that the book, like if you believe a book needs to exist in the world, you should create it for that reason alone. And then don't worry about making it perfect because you can do that through the editing process. Like you can't edit a blank page. That was like my biggest takeaway from all of the writing process of a book is you have to have something on paper, then you can improve it. I mean, I think we were on like draft 11 by the time it was done, but it's just that iterative process, but it doesn't start until you put some words down on paper. So we went through this process of first kind of getting your mindset right that doesn't need to be perfect on the first try. And then we worked on how do we find a writing process that makes sense with our work schedule and everything else. And what I found ended up working really well for the first draft of the book was actually dictating it. Because we talked through it so much and taught the course, it was much easier to talk through the content as a first draft and then go back and clean it up than to just write it. So I use this software called Super Whisper that works for a Mac. It's like an AI software. And the transcription level on that is really great.
I love that idea. That's the first time anyone suggested that kind of approach on the podcast or that I've heard in general.
Yeah, and I don't know if it'd work for for fiction writers because I have no experience writing fiction. I think that's actually a harder thing to do because you're creating a world and a storyline. Like I'm just telling people, stuff we know that works. And so I think our job's a little easier. But it really, for us, it sped up the process quite a bit.
So you talked about the imposter syndrome. You talk about the fears that come with trying to write a book. What other hurdles did you have to face when it came to sitting down and committing to the process?
So my book's co-authored with the co-founder of our company, my brother, Taryn Bragdon, who founded a nonprofit that's been very successful. They raise about $20 million a year. So figuring out how to co-author a book and work on that, and which role, who writes what, and how you edit, and going back and forth. And we both live in different states. And then we had to find an editor. We ended up going with an editor, this guy who had been a high school teacher for about 30 years and then became an editor for a company called Good Comma Editing. This guy, Greg Kurtz, really started helping us take that kind of first or second draft and really polishing it to be content that would be useful to people. So by setting a deadline of meeting with him on a weekly, or sometimes it was a bi-weekly, every 2-week basis, it forced a deadline of, we need to get this chunk of the book written, at least to a draft that we're not embarrassed to show somebody. And so the process was dictate the first draft, clean it up, then both of us would go over it, and then we'd send it to Greg, and he would give feedback on it. And then after that, and those revisions, then we started beta testing it with early readers.
As a result of writing a book like this, especially about a process that you and your brother have put together, after you wrote the book, did it affect how you viewed your business or how you viewed your content?
So what's interesting is it made certain sections a lot tighter, how you teach it, because writing really has to make your thoughts a lot more disciplined and a lot tighter. So we changed certain sections of the class where you can not necessarily explain it poorly, but you have a lot more room to talk when you're doing something live and you can see people's faces. And if they're confused, when you have a book and you're writing it, if it's not written well or the analogy doesn't quite work, people are confused and they either stop reading or they skip over it. So when we were doing the beta readers, they would highlight these certain texts and say, this is confusing, or this is too slow, or this doesn't make sense. And that was very helpful because it made us realize like a couple of the things we were teaching didn't quite resonate the way when we taught it live, it would land, but it wouldn't land on paper.
Interesting. In just a summary, what does the book cover?
So the book covers major donor fundraising, and it looks at it from more of like a business perspective on how do you grow major donor fundraising as a nonprofit. And the big thing to realize, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people, is how nonprofits are actually funded. So if you look at an average nonprofit here in America, they follow what's known as like a power law or a Pareto principle, where about 20% of donors drive about 80% of the total fundraising revenue. So you have this dynamic where just a handful of the donors who give to an organization driving the majority of the revenue, but organizations don't really know like what makes it so that you can grow that pool of people, that 20% driving 80% of the revenue. What are the things that make them excited to increase their giving? And then what makes them excited to give more consistently? So in our book, we talk about that there's kind of 3 big principles of major donor fundraising. The first one is you want to ask only once a year for money and do it with a persuasive pitch. So major donors tend to give their money on an annualized basis. So they give once a year, and you want to align your organization to ask them only once a year. So that way you don't feel like every time you talk to that nonprofit, they're asking you for money. It's like on a structured format, and it's once a year. And then the second principle is you want to treat your donors like partners. So one of the challenging things about asking for money and why it makes people so uncomfortable is we kind of think of ourselves when we ask for money like we're Oliver Twist. And the donor's like way up here and we're down here, and it's more like almost begging or panhandling. And you're this like supplicant and the donor's up here like kind of giving you scraps or feeling bad for you and giving to you out of pity. But the reality is big donors don't give out of pity. Like that doesn't really happen. They might give to someone they feel bad about, that certainly happens, but they don't give in a big way because of pity. They give because they have been blessed to have resources and have grown their wealth, and they want to have an impact in their community or in their town or whatever sector they're giving in, but they don't have the time to do it themselves. So they're looking and actively trying to find good nonprofit groups to partner with to have a big impact. So your nonprofit has the skills, the talent, the team, and the time to do this, but what you don't have is the resources. So you really need to think of your donors as partners with you. You have the time and the skills, and they have the resources, and as a partnership, you can make big things happen. And then the last thing is, you don't need to do a ton of activity and find, dozens of new donors. What you need to do is focus on finding a few key new partners each year and really look at who are people that can be referred to your organization from your existing donor pool. You want more people who are like the 20% that are driving the majority of your revenue. You want to find people like them. So that's kind of the big picture look at it. Ask only once a year with a persuasive pitch. Then you want to treat your donors really well, like partners, and give them like a Ritz-Carlton level of service from your organization. And then finding a few new key partners each and every year to grow your nonprofit.
How difficult is this process? I know that I'm definitely not the CEO of a nonprofit, and I'm intimidated by the process. But I'm going to assume just for a second that your target audience is someone who's at peace with the work that goes into staying afloat. But still, how difficult is it to follow through and to keep the wheels rolling using this process?
That's a really good question. And the answer is it depends, I think, is the honest answer.
That's honest. But that's honest. Yeah.
What we find is the people who do the best using our system are people who either have started a nonprofit or they kind of think like a founder. And so what that means is they really are passionate about the work of the nonprofit. And usually they're really good at it. Like there's a group that does mission work in Ethiopia. And the woman, Marcy Erickson, who founded it, she founded it when she was on a missions trip in Ethiopia, started this, and kind of has known it from when they were helping just 4 people to now when they're helping 50,000. So she gets how everything works. But typically, people who are really passionate founders are not as comfortable asking for money and with the promotion side of the business. But the great thing about fundraising is it's just a skill. And it's like any skill, whether, it's learning to be better at basketball or learning to be better at, weightlifting or whatever your kind of skill you're working at. It's just about breaking it down into incremental steps and then getting better at it. So one of the things that we do with nonprofit leaders is sometimes they're not comfortable asking for money because they either don't know how to do it or they're not comfortable with the words that they're going to say when they're asking for money. So we help them build a persuasive pitch that makes it easier for them to know exactly what they're going to say in the donor meeting and then how to ask for money. I can walk through if you want the steps of a pitch, but the big thing is you want to share kind of a big vision of where you're going as an organization, but also how it works and then mix in some stories of success. And then you end with asking for money. And when you make that ask, you pause at the end, you make the ask. So if I was asking you, I'd say, you'd pause when I get to the end of the ask and you pause and stop talking and then wait for the donor to respond. And that's probably the most difficult part, is being comfortable in that silence after you've made the ask and you're waiting for, hopefully, your pitch to work and you get either a yes or follow up in a few weeks.
That, I believe, is probably the hardest part, just sitting there in the silence and not knowing if you've done your job right or not.
Yeah, but the funny thing about it is if you kind of reframe that, yes, it's sitting in silence, but if you've made a compelling case for your nonprofit, you've talked about, here's the problem that we solve, And then here's how we solve it. And then you dive a little deeper and say, like, we do it through this really unique process that involves 3 steps. And you list those off. And then you can go and say, in fact, just last month we had this success story. You tell a great success story. And you say, but here's the big opportunity. And you paint a big vision for where the organization is going. And you kind of essentially talk about it like 3 years from now, here's where we're going to be. And then you end with a pitch where you make the ask for a specific amount of money. And then you stop talking. You've given them a lot of information to process. It's almost like you're actually honoring them by being quiet. You're letting them think about all the information you've just said and allowing the pitch to do its work. If it's persuasive, it's going to be effective. And you want to have confidence in that I've made the best case possible, and now it's up to the pitch to do its magic.
So I want to make sure that we don't give the whole book away. I want to make sure that people invest in getting it and opening it and getting familiar with the content. But if you don't mind, tell us a bit about what goes into an effective pitch, and tell me some of the things that you see other people just get flat out wrong who are struggling with this.
Sure. So maybe the easiest way to talk about this is to think about if you were going to pitch your book. Like there's mostly authors who listen to this podcast. So let's look at like how we would pitch our book. So one of the simplest pitches you can do is this pitch that comes from the book. It's called The One-Page Marketing Plan by Alan Dibbs. And it's this great book. It's sold probably 1 million copies or something. But he has this formula that's problem, solution, then story. So how it would go is if you're being introduced and someone says, oh, what do you do? Or what are you working on? You'd say, in my case with writing a book on fundraising, I could say, well, you know how a lot of nonprofits really struggle to raise money? Well, what we do is I have a book that teaches them how to ask for a 6-figure or 7-figure donation. And in fact, just last month, we had someone write and tell us about that they had read our book, used one of the tactics where we talked about how to do this in a really unique way in a restaurant and how to work with your waiter to make sure your pitch goes off well. And that person told us how they used the tactic and got a 7-figure gift from a donor. And they wouldn't have had the same confidence level to ask for that at a restaurant, but because they'd used the tactic that we talked about in the book, they were able to do it. So you can almost use that formula for anyone who is creating a pitch. So it's identify the big problem that your book solves, and then how you solve it. So you know how, and then you talk about the problem. Then what we do or what my book does, talk about the solution, and then tell a little snippet from the book or a little story about the effect of someone who read the book and applied it.
It sounds to me like this book is relevant to more people than just nonprofits. Cough, cough. This is very wide-reaching.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is it's basically based on just sales principles that work in all businesses. Like it's about treating customers really well, whether your customer is a donor in the nonprofit sense or a customer in the for-profit world or a reader, if you're an author. It's about, how do we treat them well? And then how do we get them excited to continue to partner with us? And I think when it comes to a pitch, what people do wrong, to answer your question two times ago, is sometimes we dive too quickly into either really heavy into the emotion. We tell a lot of stories because you get all this feedback from, books about stories that you should tell more stories. So we do like really super job telling stories. Or on the other side of it is people dive really into the tactics and talk about all the specifics of the work because they really like the work they're doing. But what really persuades people is a mix of all three. The great thing about stories is they're sticky. People tend to remember them. But you want to also have specifics because specifics are what actually sell. And then you want to have a few statistics to back something up. So it's about stories for the stickiness, specifics to actually like make the sale because it makes people confident that you know how to solve the problem. And then you want to have just a few statistics in there to reinforce that you've done the data or you've done the research and you have the data to back up whatever you're proposing or whatever you're selling.
I like the example that you give of the pitch and how practical it is. One of the things that comes to mind for me is, well, what about a book? Let's say we're building a pitch for a book. What would you do for something that was much more subjective, like a fantasy novel, or maybe a book about your own life? Because these are examples that are a little bit more personal, or maybe the audience is not data driven as much as maybe a business book audience might be. What kind of pitch would you make for a novel?
Okay, so for a novel, and I'll be honest, I don't read a ton of fantasy books, so I'm not like, that's an area where I don't have a lot of expertise. But for someone where they're writing like a memoir or talking about like their life experience, wanting to share that, I think the first thing I would do before writing a pitch is think about who's my customer, who's my reader, and then think about like, what if someone read my book or however you've proposed the book, if it's just an outline or an idea, what's the problem they're trying to solve when they're picking up my book? So that's the very first question. Like, is it entertainment? And this is going to be like a fun read on the beach? Is it, there's a life lesson in there? Like, what are they trying to solve? Like, I just read a memoir a few months ago called Troubled. It's by Rob Henderson. And it's all about this kid who grew up in foster care in California. So it's this interesting look at his perspective growing up in foster care, and then he goes on to get a PhD at Cambridge. And so it's like two worlds, goes to Yale and then Cambridge. And so like his view of like being in the like kind of the poorest, lowest class, and then being in the highest class, and he has some really interesting insights on humans from that. But think about like, what's in it for them? Like, it's great to tell our story, but what's their takeaway is where I'd start to begin with.
And then from there, it's just a matter of, there was a story component in there too. You know how people struggle with X, we deliver on Y. Would you communicate that the same way?
Right. So once you've figured out what's the problem your reader is trying to solve, like, for example, say you're writing a memoir about your early life between, 0 and 25, like life lessons because you had this unique experience. So maybe your customer and maybe the people who would get the most value out of it are people who are in that window, like 18 to 21-year-olds who are trying to figure out their life, and you're one or two steps ahead of them writing about how you figured it out. So if you think about the problem that they're trying to solve is figuring out the next stage of their life. So if you were making a pitch for your book, you talk about how, like, you might talk about something along the lines of, one of the biggest challenges of being 18 is you have your whole life in front of you, but you don't know which direction to move. This book is about one person's path to figuring out what's the next step and then the next step after that. And then you would talk about, what was the takeaway, or like, kind of what's the arc of the character, and what was the personal change that you went through in that process. And so this is where, like, where we don't have an exact example, it makes it a little challenging. But usually there is a change in the character, especially like in a memoir or even a fantasy novel. Like, we read novels to see the change of an individual. They start out as, Luke Skywalker, where he doesn't know how to do anything. And then at the end, he's like a Jedi, right? We read it to see people change, and we like to see them like put in challenging situations and then come out on the other end. So thinking about like a memoir, how would you do that so that you could show somebody else, here's a model of how you could go through and change your life and, hopefully end up in a better place at the end. So I think it's first thinking about the problem from your reader's perspective, and then crafting your solution and talking about that. Like, what this book does is, and then you talk about like kind of the three big things that the book does or the problems that it solves. And one of the things you can do is, if you're writing something that's kind of a more common story, that like people kind of know that story arc. You want to think about what's your unique spin on it. And so if it's common, you want to think about what's unique. And if it's something that's brand new, that's like really different, you want to think about like, okay, how do we make this familiar to people? Which is why like genres in writing exist, right? Like it's a crime novel and they follow, or a detective novel, and it always starts with a case, right? Like that's how most detective books start. You start with a case, and then there's like the detective main character, and then they go through the arc of trying to find the case, and then the last chapter it wraps up, or something like that. So that might be what people are familiar with. Then it's like, what's your unique twist on it? You can also look for inspiration from how people pitch movies, where they talk about the concept of, like the movie Alien. It's going to date us a little bit. A lot of us have seen that, but Alien is basically Jaws on a boat, on a spaceship rather. So it's thinking about like, is there a way to sell the concept of my book so people can understand it quickly?
So I really like the pitch idea and the pitch approach. And it works really, really well when you're approaching an audience that is maybe data-driven or numbers-driven, especially when it comes down to how people can raise money doing this exercise or who they need to target and the metrics. What about when it's something, a book, that's much more subjective when it comes to its audience? Like, let's say a novel or a piece of historical fiction. How would you create a pitch for one of those?
So let me ask you a couple of questions. So I think the first thing you want to think about whenever you're selling something or getting someone, in the case of a book, to pick your book up off the shelf or put it in their Amazon cart and hit buy. So they can just read a little snippet, like there's not a ton to sell it, or you're talking to them and you're trying to convince them, is think about what's the problem this solves for my reader? Like, what is the purpose of this book for my reader? And so if it's historical fiction, it's probably to entertain, but also to learn a little bit about a time period, right? Something like that. So do you have some more details on this example on like what type of historical fiction you'd be selling?
Let's go with my favorite book, The Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. It's a fantasy kind of world, but it is based off of a realistic version of England in the Dark Ages. Not a whole lot of fantasy things happening apart from the fact that it is a fabricated country.
So as someone who's read the book, what is the problem that book solves for somebody picking it up for the first time?
Combination of escapism into one of your favorite genres, and then also just excellent storytelling dripping with sarcasm.
Okay, so it's funny. It transports you into a different world that's familiar but a little different because it feels like it's historical, but it has the fantasy overlay. And then it's enjoyable in that like
very
it's humorous. You kind of chuckle or laugh while you're reading it. Okay. And then what do you think sets this apart? So lots of historical fiction. There's also probably lots of historical fiction that's in the fantasy space, like that might make it somewhat unique. But what else sets it apart from other books?
It has very enjoyable characters. I think that it does an excellent job of not going over the top with canon. Like with Harry Potter, where usually by the time you read the last one, all the others have been summarized to the point where it's no point in going back. A lot of listeners are going to hate me for that comment, but it's a critic podcast. I'm allowed to do that. Very solid written, consistency, a lot of consistency across all the books that he's written.
Okay. And what would you say is your biggest takeaway after reading it? Like when you look back on it, how do you feel about the book?
I feel like heroes come in all packages. There are people who are overcoming issues just from being small to being large, from being in situations that they don't really feel equipped for naturally, that they develop the talent for. It's very good at effort being paid off in the end.
Okay. So given that, I think a short pitch, what you could do for a book like that is there's so many fantasy and historical novels out there. Like they line all the shelves. And picking the right one where you love the characters, love the story, and you enjoy reading it and can't put it down, that's sometimes hard to find. But what I love about this book is it has all three. It's entertaining. The writing's great. There's like this nice undercurrent of sarcasm built into the story. The characters are relatable. There's no one there who is a Superman who you can't relate to because they have no flaws. And the third thing, and I think this is actually the most important thing when it comes to this book, is how much you think about it after you're done reading it. Because the author does a great job putting characters into different situations, and you see how anyone can become heroic with whatever tools they have, whatever personality, whatever their given gifts are, how they can do that and not only overcome great challenges, but become better people. And I think that's why I keep picking up the book and rereading it. And so that's why I'd encourage you to pick it up, because it's a great read. It's entertaining. It's funny. But you think about the characters long after you're done reading it, and you just always have a good experience with it.
I think that's an excellent answer. Trevor, let's say that I'm in a situation where I'm on the fence about writing a book. What kind of advice would you have for a first-time book writer?
So I would really think about why you're on the fence. Like, if you feel like a book needs to be written, what's holding you back? Like, and then try to write down or talk with somebody and identify like what is actually holding you back. Is it a time issue? You're worried you don't have enough time to do it? Is it a issue where you're worried about kind of the judgment that comes with doing any sort of creative work? You do something and then you release it to the world, and sometimes the world's a difficult, a harsh critic. Is it like that component, or is it something else? So in learning, we talk about how there's a mindset, a skill set, or a tool set gap sometimes with people, like what prevents them from doing something. So sometimes it's a mindset, right? Like we have to adjust and change our mindset about it. Like we think of ourselves not as an author. Well, you not an author until you write something, right? And then you become an author. But like thinking about like, what do I need to change on the mindset side? And then sometimes it's a skill set. Like maybe you're not great at writing yet, or you're not great at like just typing that first draft. So maybe you try dictation. That's what worked for me, is dictating the first draft because I was much more comfortable talking than I was typing. So like it could be a skill set. And then occasionally it's a tool set, which is more like, I don't have a program to, a word processor or whatever. But with writing, you can write on a piece of paper, you can open Word or Google Docs. So like we use Google Docs. It wasn't anything super sophisticated for that. So I would kind of try to identify it and then attack each problem and look at, is it true? And then how can I change it? So if it's mindset, you can change a mindset, kind of reframe the situation. If it's a skill set, you can go practice and get better at it, or find what you already do well, like talking. If you talk well, if you can talk, you can dictate, and that might get you the first draft. And then my last piece of advice and my biggest takeaway from writing, and I mentioned this earlier, is you can't edit a blank page. You got to get something down on paper, and then you can make it better. And it really, writing's in the editing. Getting that first draft is nothing like the end draft. And that's actually the cool part, because you can work on a certain section that you don't like, and then you can make it so you actually like it by the end. And that's the fun, I think, of writing. And putting something and doing something and putting it out in the world is, at the end of the day, it can have a really big impact on other people's lives if you've done a great job.
Mm-hmm. Well, Trevor, I am thankful for your time coming on. I think that you are very talented in the work that you've done, even if this is your first book. I say this as someone who went through it myself. It's very well put together. But if someone wanted to get a hold of you, or if they had questions, or they wanted to get a copy of the book, what's the best place for them to go to?
Sure. Our book's available on Amazon. Just type in Seven-Figure Fundraising, or you put in my name, Trevor Bragdon. It's also available in Audible as well. And if people want to reach out, our website, sevenfigurefundraising.com with the number 7, or they can email me at trevor@sevenfigurefundraising.com. I'm happy to give advice, or if you have a question about fundraising, happy to reply and hopefully help you raise the money you need to be successful and grow your nonprofit, because there's a lot of great organizations out there, and more money means we can have more impact with our mission, whatever they are, with your nonprofit.
That's fantastic. And we will have those links down in the show notes below. Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks, Isaac.
If you would like a copy of 7-Figure Fundraising, you can find it by following the link down in the show notes below, or by going to sevenfigurefundraising.com. And 7 is as in the number, not the word, the number, sevenfigurefundraising.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure that you share it with a friend, give it a 5-star review, and subscribe so you never miss our next release. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and until then, we will see you next time.